All right. Listen, guys, let's get started. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome both Alex Darcy and Denis. Alex was here recently in a virtual way. Derek is yet to come. So some of these fine days, we're going to have to get Derek to actually physically come here. The first ever video performance I ever saw was Alex Darcy, who came here and did a UKLBC by video before this was even invented many, many years ago. So it's great to be able to do this in a slightly different way where you can actually see us and interact with us, which is going to be pretty cool, I think. So we're really looking forward to hearing from the two of you on colonial narratives are difficult to shake loose. And as we've been hearing today, they really are. So go for it, guys.
Hi, everybody. So we'll just jump right in. Before beginning, though, we would like to acknowledge the land where we're presenting from. So where I live, where I grew up, and where I work, it has been, and it has been for thousands of years, the home to the Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, who are the treaty holders here and the acknowledged caretakers. This is territory that falls under the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Covenant, which is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Anishnaabe, and allied nations to peacefully share and care for the land. I was born here and I have a long family history in the area, but when you go back a few generations, my ancestors weren't from here. And so in that way, I am a settler person.
And I'm speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen peoples, where my family has been for more than 3 generations now, uninvited. So I too am a settler person. And so I acknowledge the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Osage peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day.
So it's important for us to acknowledge these truths, especially in this talk, because it was only once we brought them to the forefront of our thinking that these ideas that we'll be talking about today began to crystallize. We'd also like to acknowledge an assumption of ours in speaking to you today, which is that this audience is primarily based outside of North America, and that this will have important implications for how our points are understood and conceptualized by you. We're going to be working toward the point, however, that colonialism is inseparable from the study of the English language and its worldwide varieties, whether historically or contemporaneously. And as scholars of English, we all have responsibilities that derive from this fact. So on that note, we want to share the full context of our title. These are the words of Ojibwe journalist Jesse Wente, who so succinctly expressed what is at the core of the critique we'll present today and the way forward. Colonial narratives are difficult to shake loose as they've been presented as history for generations, but we can do it, we have to. This tweet is in specific reference to the debate over removing monuments to Canada's first Prime Minister, an architect of the genocidal system that targeted the Indigenous peoples of these lands. But the kernel of the statement is broadly important. And as we'll suggest today, it's relevant for understanding the history not only of Canadian English, but the history of all varieties of English more generally, regardless of the type of colonialism they emerged under. But let's start with English in what is currently known as Canada. Now, if you know one fact about Canadian English, it's probably this. Within this big sort of banana-shaped region at the top of the slide here, circled in red, is a, quote, remarkably homogeneous variety. The most detailed description of the phonologies of North American English dialects, that is the Atlas of North American English, states, to a large extent, a single type of English is spoken across the 4,500 kilometers from Vancouver on the far west coast to Ottawa in the eastern region. Just to make that real for you, that's like going from London to Newcastle 10 times over. The leading hypothesis as to how such homogeneity arose, it's typically attributed to the United Empire Loyalists. This was a group of Americans by birth who were granted land by the British Crown after the American Revolution. The story goes something like this here on the slide, quoting Chambers. The key here is that the people who come after the founding population, the second or third generation of settlers, they may come from far and wide, but their children will speak under ordinary circumstances, just like the children whose parents arrived before them. The sounds of the speech was directly descended from these loyalists. Or with more brevity, quoting Avis, English-speaking Canada was created by the loyalists. Now, this is not untrue. The problem, however, is not about what it does say, but in what it doesn't say. Absent from this narrative, which we have been as guilty of maintaining as anyone else, is the role of, or even the existence of, a diversity of Indigenous voices that English has been in contact with for more than 2 centuries now. So using Jesse Wente's terminology, what you have before you here is a colonial narrative, and it's our starting point for today. We have 2 goals for the talk today. First, we want to demonstrate how settler colonialism has shaped Englishes around the world. We'll start by interrogating both the term post-colonial, as used in the description of world Englishes, and challenge Schneider's theory of the development of so-called post-colonial Englishes as following a single evolutionary pathway. Following the literature on colonialism and Indigenous studies, we assert that some, quote, post-colonial Englishes, including Canadian English, exist in a context of settler colonialism, and as such should be more accurately labeled as settler colonial Englishes. We argue that this is not just a matter of terminology, and on the basis of 2 case studies, we'll review the ways that different colonial contexts have distinct socio-linguistic outcomes. We're then going to build on this to illustrate the ways that colonial and Euro-American mindsets ultimately shape Western linguistic and sociolinguistic epistemologies. So this is our second goal. And in having this discussion with you, we recognize that it might make you uncomfortable at times. And yet this very state of discomfort, that itself is a privilege that's bestowed by current understandings and praxis in our field.
So first, let's define settler colonialism as a specific type of colonialism. So colonialism broadly can be defined as any foreign intrusion of political power of one territory into another territory. The relationship between the colonists and the colonized is always unequal. And the main goals of colonialism have been the extraction of natural resources, exploitation of human resources, the establishment of strategic commercial, political, and/or military posts, and the acquisition of land. So colonial contexts in which the main goal is the expropriation of land and repopulation with colonists is settler colonialism. Over the last 20 years or so, much has been discussed about the goals and methods of settler colonialism. Patrick Wolfe, the late Australian anthropologist and the first to discuss settler colonialism by name, has observed that it employs a logic of elimination. So because the colonial goal is the expropriation of land, any previous inhabitants of the land must be eliminated. This can happen through overt violence, but also, and what was commonly seen across the 19th and 20th centuries, through the erasure of Indigenous languages, cultures, histories, geographies, and epistemologies. This effectively erases Indigenous identities through assimilationist and absorptionist policies and praxis, which critically did not and do not happen only at the moment of contact. Rather, they continue through to today. Because of this, scholars of settler colonialism note that it's an ongoing structure. It's not an event. Settlers come to stay, and they have stayed. They do stay. As such, there's no endpoint to settler colonialism. There's been no decolonization. There is no obvious pathway to decolonization. And since settler colonial policies and practices remain in place, there is nothing post about this kind of colonial context. It's ongoing. What this means is that English is spoken in the context of settler colonialism should not be referred to as post-colonial Englishes. That's wholly inaccurate and entirely inappropriate. It amounts to a further erasure of the realities of Indigenous peoples. So we propose that the term settler colonial Englishes be used to describe varieties spoken in context of ongoing settler colonialism, such as Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, and American Englishes. As we noted earlier, this distinction between settler colonial Englishes and post-colonial Englishes has critical sociolinguistic consequences in theory, in description, and in empiricism. So let's think through Schneider's dynamic model of post-colonial Englishes. In what can only be described as a thorough description of the histories and structures of at least a dozen varieties of English, Schneider argues that each is going through the same 5 phases of evolution, though each may currently be at a different stage. And in turn, each phase is defined by 4 parameters. Now, the details aren't strictly important for what we want to say today, but the general process looks something like this. English arrives in a new colony where Indigenous languages exist. The English spoken by settlers, who may not all speak the same dialect, soon coalesce as a single variety. At the same time, an Indigenous strand of English develops, influenced by English generally, the settler strand locally, and the Indigenous languages through contact effects. Eventually, and critically for this model, the settler and Indigenous strands converge. So quoting Schneider, mutual negotiation results in a shared variety, which is a second language for some and a first language, incorporating erstwhile L2 transfer features for others. The result here is a post-colonial English. Now, we don't want to imply that Schneider is ignorant of the colonial histories of the varieties he describes. He's not. He discusses possible effects at length. Moreover, without his extensive description of World Englishes and his concept of the dynamic model, we wouldn't have even been able to begin to elucidate the distinctions we'll discuss today, let alone to link them with settler colonialism on the one hand and with other kinds of colonialism, which are numerous, on the other. Where we differ from Schneider is in the kind of distinction to make between colonial settings. For him, all colonial Englishes are placed on a multidimensional continuum, all under a single umbrella, and all subject to the same general dynamics of evolution. For us, there's a categorical break between varieties that develop under settler colonialism and those that develop under other colonial circumstances. The critical difference in settler states is that convergence between settler and Indigenous strands doesn't happen for the very real structural reason that mutual negotiation or accommodation of the Indigenous strand is not possible. The emphasis is on erasure consistent with the goals of settler colonialism.
So let's turn to some evidence. We're going to briefly describe 2 of the 4 cases that we talked about in our 2018 paper. We're going to use Canadian English as our settler colonial example, and we're going to contrast this with Indian English. Canada is a prime example of settler colonialism. As Coulthard argues, Canadian state formation required first and foremost land. This goal was and is achieved through what one might expect, that is, overt practices of violence like forced starvation. But while such overt state violence against Indigenous people ended in the 1960s, the elimination of Indigenous people as cultural, political, and legal peoples distinguishable from the rest of Canada continued then and now through multiple policies and practices, both at the national and more local levels, including the forcible removal of children via the residential school system and the current child welfare program, to state policies like the pass system, the Indian Act, and the White Paper. Well, many treaties were signed between Britain and Indigenous people. It should not be presumed that Britain did not view Canada as terra nullius, that is, a territory that is not owned by anyone. The signing of those treaties was more often about staking claim from competing European interests than it was about the peaceful coexistence of settlers and Indigenous people. In Canada, there has been no decolonization. To be clear, these treaties are not historical artifacts. They have real contemporary consequences for the statehood of Canada, and they infer obligations and responsibilities for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people who live here alike. The colonial context of India is different. Beginning in the 17th century, Britain established extensive colonial outposts throughout South Asia. Here, the colonial goal wasn't about land. It was about trade and the exploitation of natural and human resources. The few British settlers who came nearly all left after formal decolonization in 1947. English remained, however, and has been a part of official multilingual educational policy since 1968. With that in mind, let's start looking at the contrast between Canadian English and Indian English. We're going to make 4 sociolinguistic contrasts. We'll compare the nature of Indigenous loanwords, the extent of grammatical contact phenomena, the question of who is understood to speak the nationally labeled variety, and the extent of English homogeneity within each country. We're going to begin with the nature of Indigenous loanwords. Here, we've listed a few loanwords from various Indigenous languages into Canadian English. We've categorized them into 3 groups. There are toponyms. So for example, the name of the city that I live in comes from the Ganagahaga word Takarano. There are also words for flora, fauna, and the environment, like caribou, which comes from Mi'kmaq, and coho from Hockamelum. We also have words for cultural concepts that would have been new to the early settlers. So for example, Inukshuk from Inuktitut. While there are many loanwords from a vast variety of Indigenous languages, like these here are just a small handful, the vast majority, if not all, fall into the 3 categories listed here. In Indian English, though, while there are loanwords from these same categories, in contrast, there are also loanwords in more basic or core domains of vocabulary that represent what Schneider refers to as a wide range of domains of everyday life. We've provided just a few examples here, in this case, all borrowed from Hindi. So for example, yar meaning friend and tonda meaning cool. The important distinction here is that qualitative difference between the types of loanwords that can be found. In Canadian English, borrowing is limited to the naming of places and things that are conceptually new. In Indian English, borrowings compete with imported English words in a wider spectrum of lexical domains. Our second piece of linguistic evidence comes from grammatical contact effects between English and Indigenous languages, or the lack thereof. Specifically in Canadian English, we're not aware of any phonological, morphosyntactic, or discourse pragmatic phenomena that is a result of contact with any Indigenous language. Any regional or distinctive features of Canadian English that exist are vestiges of earlier Englishes that were maintained or expanded upon in the colonial context. In contrast, Indian English exhibits clear effects of language contact with Indigenous languages in the phonological, morphosyntactic, and discourse pragmatic domains. Phonologically, Schneider notes that there are many instances of transfer into Indian English from Indo-Aryan and Dravidian languages. So, for example, the presence of retroflex consonants and unaspirated syllable initial voiceless stops. An example of morphosyntactic transfer in Indian English is the presence of non-initial there existentials, like in one. If time is there, I can read something. In my family, 5 members are there. Long argues that this structure is a result of contact with local languages. Both Indo-Aryan and Dravidian languages have subject-object-verb word order, and existential-like constructions can be made by preposing the focused constituent. So in 2a, we have a canonical SOV sentence, book table on is, and in the existential-like construction in 2b, the postpositional phrase table on is preposed. So Lang argues that this structure was essentially transferred into Indian English. But since English requires that the verb be have an internal complement, Indian English filled that complement of be with a dummy there, resulting in this noun phrase plus be plus there construction like we see in 1. Finally, Indian English also exhibits a unique set of discourse pragmatic markers that are calqued or directly borrowed from indigenous languages. You can see some examples borrowed from Hindi on the slide here. The third point of contrast concerns how speakers of the nationally labeled variety, or the demolect, are conceptualized. In Canada, this demolect, Canadian English, is a glossonym for the English spoken by settler people. Indigenous strands or varieties, when they are described, are distinguished as what we might call chthonilects. They're applied with respect to ethno-regional parameters alone. So we have Inuit English or First Nations English, for example. In a context like India, however, that demolect is typically the indigenous strand, or at least that hybrid of the indigenous and settler strands that Schneider talks about. A settler strand is essentially non-existent because the colonial goal was not to stay, and most settlers, as we said before, left before or during formal decolonization. The final point of contrast returns to our observation from the beginning of the talk, and it's about the extent of homogeneity and how it depends on the nature of colonialism. In Canada, commentary aimed at large-scale dialect homogeneity acknowledges continuous in-migration and the existence of sociolects. But the overarching observation is that these minor perturbations aside, the national variety is marked by continuity across broad geographic space. This contrasts with other colonial contexts, as exemplified by Indian English, which Schneider describes as coming in a range of varieties, both regional and social. Regionality shows in speaker's accent, which frequently displays interference from regional L1s, and thus warrants labels like Marathi English, Hindustani English, and Kannada English. The contrast, though, between India on the one hand and Canada on the other is remarkable, though, when we consider the parallel extents of indigenous language diversity in these two places. On each of the maps you can see here, different colors indicate different unrelated language families. Although the indigenous populations of Canada are culturally and linguistically diverse, internal migration spread a relatively homogeneous variety of English across this vast space. In India, as we just saw, regional varieties of English persist. What we want to suggest is that the Canadian outcome, which bypasses contact with indigenous languages, arises only in a context of settler colonialism. And so this runs counter to Schneider's dynamic model. Specifically, Schneider argues that the emergence of post-colonial Englishes is a process of linguistic convergence, in which a variety is crystallized via a shared identity, one that is negotiated through mutual alignment and accommodation. This gives rise to linguistic hybridity as English is modified through contact with indigenous languages initially and indigenous strands of English eventually. We see this in India, but we don't see this in Canada. If the developmental pathway that resulted in Canadian English was one of such convergence as a consequence of bidirectional accommodation and negotiation between English and the local languages with which it was in contact, then it would not be marked by such large-scale homogeneity in the face of extensive indigenous linguistic diversity. The prediction would be one of regionally variegated Englishes, characterized by influence from the dominant indigenous language or languages within a given territory. So we would have a Toronto English influenced by Anishnaabe and Onondaga, and a Vancouver English influenced by Hakaminam and Squamish-Stitcham. As the evidence illustrates, however, this is not the case in settler colonial varieties for the very reason that influence from indigenous languages is not possible due to settler colonialism's logic of elimination. The linguistic homogeneity exemplified in Canada would not have been a possible outcome without settler colonialism. So to return the idea of breaking loose of colonial narratives, we must add this part of the story to the narrative of Canadian English. We want to pause at this point to critique a line from Schneider's introduction, as he talks about how remarkable it is that English is spoken around the world. He says our virtual traveler will encounter native speakers of English, not only in Canada and New Zealand, where this would be expected, but also Nigeria and Singapore, and many more parts of the world in which English is not an ancestral language. This idea that native speakers of English are expected in Canada and New Zealand, but not perhaps in other locales, on the basis that English is an ancestral language in Canada and New Zealand, is a poignant testament to the arguments that we've made today. This statement is in fact part and parcel of settler colonialism, and it's only sustainable in a settler colonial narrative. And that's because it follows a logic of elimination. Think about it. English is not an ancestral language of Canada or New Zealand or Australia or the United States. And yet, Schneider's not alone here, and not even in the minority in expressing such statements. Alex and I have been just as culpable in our thinking and in our own work in the past. And this is because settler colonialism is insidious. We've just shown how it has sociolinguistic consequences, but statements like Schneider's here and our own early theorizing of Canadian English homogeneity and countless other works demonstrates that it isn't just an overlooked factor in sociolinguistic development. Rather, it has utterly shaped the foundations of our field. Settler colonialism itself is what has rendered the effects and history of settler colonialism to be nearly invisible. Settler colonialism cloaks itself through erasure of everything else.
To begin to unravel this, we're going to tell you a story. It's a parable, really. And it goes like this. There are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys. How's the water?" And the two young fish, they swim on for a bit. And then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" Until about 5 years ago, we too were a couple of fish, so immersed in the story of how remarkable the homogeneity of Canadian English is, to even recognize that what we were really immersed in was this mentality of settler colonialism. We were raised, we were educated, we were trained in this way of seeing and understanding the world, personally, professionally. And so until that ambient context was brought to our attention, ultimately by the work of Indigenous peoples, we simply failed to recognize it. And we failed to recognize the role it plays in all aspects of our work, from theory to praxis. And while we're focusing on sociolinguistics and world Englishes, here in this talk, this is actually a reality that imbues all fields of linguistics. So yeah, What the hell is water?
So over the last few weeks, we've been thinking about how settler colonialism and really colonialism writ large has shaped the field of linguistics. We're just going to mention a few examples that we've thought of here. We discussed one of these examples in a recent editorial that we wrote in the journal American Speech. Now, in a nutshell, this journal's mandate is to publish, and I'm quoting here, research dealing principally with the English language in the Western Hemisphere. Now, hopefully the issue is obvious here. There are many ways to speak in America. The privileging of English here, this is a powerful example of erasure. Our next 3 points here are interlinked in that they each privilege colonial and Euro-American ways of knowing over other ways of knowing. Essentially, all modern Western linguistic approaches operate on the mindset that linguistics is an objective science, and the thing we study, language, is a benign object. This has many implications from how we understand our role in the communities we work in, to how we understand the data we collect and our potential ownership of it, to how we analyze that data, and even conceive of the questions we ask and the work that we value and valorize as linguistics. There are other ways to approach all of these issues. But to recognize that, we first have to set aside the presumption that what we think to be objective truth about the world is just one possibility among other possibilities. Furthermore, our way of understanding language, conceiving of it and treating it as an object, that means that we think of it as something that can be handled. And if it can be handled, that means it can be taken. And that leads to an extractive model of research in which we collect specimens for our own use. And then we end up turning that data into a commodity, one that we use in exchange for material and reputational gain via publications. We can share it, we can trade it, we can hold it as a possession in our labs and in our work. Yet this way of understanding is completely at odds, for example, with indigenous conceptions of research as something that is fundamentally relational. And of course, the very ethical models that we hold up as models of beneficence, in which we give back to communities by using our expertise to help them, that itself relies on the concept that language is an object that we were able to take, that we were able to gain from, and now can then use that to help underserved communities to their benefit. That is, we operate within what Eve Tuck calls a damage-based theory of social change. It works like this. You demonstrate that something is broken to justify reparations. Now, this is not to say that well-intentioned people have not done tremendous good. Think about like the Ann Arbor Black English trial in the 1980s, for example. But this damage-based framework that continues to promote a kind of savior mentality. And so it reinforces, in Tuck's words, a one-dimensional notion of marginalized people as depleted, ruined, and hopeless. And as a final example for today, we can point to the proselytizing of English that occurred across a vast range of colonial contexts, often for reasons relating to helping the local population, whether it was to better them through educating them in English, or whether it was a means to bring them into British or American ways of thinking, knowing, and being. But English was also promoted for reasons related to establishing an imperialistic foothold, as was the case in the Philippines with the US, for example. This ultimately weaponized English, using it as a tool of imperialism. So this is just some of the water that we've been swimming in. And once we realize it's there, that realization, it confers an obligation on us to reflect on what that means moving forward.
And specifically, what we urge everyone to engage with is the fact that English spread as it did everywhere. So even within the UK, via colonialism. None of this spread was benign. All of it involved taking something, land, physical resources, human resources, and so on. and much of it included violence, whether physical, cultural, emotional, or otherwise. And crucially, we can't relegate this to the past. Right? This isn't history with no relevance for the shape and use and daily reality of English around the world today. The 16th through 18th centuries were the height of British imperialism. But as we've shown you, settler colonialism remains an ongoing structure with ongoing consequences, and other kinds of colonialism haven't left the sites of contact unchanged. In such places, the settlers may have left, but their legacies remain. This is just as true on the ground for speakers of English as it is for our work that relates to the lands where they speak it. So in short, while Derek and I benefit both personally and professionally from settler colonialism, everyone here who studies English benefits from colonialism professionally. And so coming back to this idea of being uncomfortable, right? This is uncomfortable. The ability to be uncomfortable, as opposed to simply having to live this reality as a person who was or is colonized, is itself a privilege that's bestowed by the benefits of colonialism and not being subjects of colonialism. In practice, what this means is that we all take on obligations that derive from this fact. At a bare minimum, we must acknowledge that the privilege to work in any other understanding of that relationship is a consequence of colonial and Euro-American approaches to language. What we'd like to suggest is that we can grow as a field, do better work, and develop better theory if we work in accountable, reciprocal relationship with speakers and open our minds to other ways of knowing.
And the more that we talk about this, the more questions we end up having. So to finish things off for today, we're going to outline some of the questions that have come up for us while preparing this talk. So first, how does this apply to other colonial contexts? What we've talked about today, it's just a first pass. And even within settler colonial contexts, there will be differences in different contexts. On that note, we're looking forward to Denis and Lynn Clark's talk tomorrow about settler colonialism and New Zealand English. But also we can ask, how do we take into account the languages of enslaved people in the US and Caribbean? Enslavement is another form of erasure. In the Caribbean, settlers didn't stay, and yet the entire social context was disrupted. What about Northern Canada, where Indigenous peoples have always made up a much larger proportion of the population than in the South? And what about plantation colonialism, trade colonialism, exploitation colonialism? What are the possible outcomes here? Are there nuances that derive from individual socio-political circumstances? We started our work distinguishing settler colonial outcomes from other outcomes in post-colonial contexts, but we actually expect that the typology is more nuanced and less binary than what we've presented today. Our second question is about the fact that there are Indigenous Englishes spoken in settler colonial contexts. So what developmental trajectories do they go through? What is the relationship between linguistic and cultural groups and the emergence and the use of such varieties? And what role do these varieties play in counter-hegemonic identity expression? Our third question is, in an imaginary future of settler Indigenous reconciliation, would there be something more like convergence via mutual accommodation as described by Schneider? More specifically, what happens when the state remains settler colonial, but there's growing recognition of the need for reconciliation? And last, how do we responsibly engage in theorizing about the development of world Englishes? We feel very strongly that there's an important role here for critical theory from outside of linguistics that is often neglected by our field. Arguments about post-colonialism and post-colonial status can't be made on the basis of linguistic evidence alone, and it's going to be necessary to engage with the work of Indigenous scholars and scholars of color especially.
So to come back to Jesse Wente's point, colonial narratives are hard to shake loose, but we can do it, and we have to do it. A lot of what Derek and I have been talking about today are ways to, quote, decolonize your mind. But, and this is really, really important, decolonization is not a metaphor, as Tuck and Yang put it. So our last question for now is this, right? What actions can we take as scholars of world Englishes to support material decolonization, or alternatively indigenization? So this list of questions that we've given today, it's not definitive, and we're not even sure if we're asking the right questions to start with. But we wanted to begin the conversation and engage you here during the question period, and in our collective work from this point in an ongoing process of critical reflection and interrogation of our assumptions, and then how to move forward from here. And that's it.
Thank you.
We can see you clapping, Karen.
Hugely thought-provoking and very much on message. You won't believe how on message it is in terms of everything we've talked about up to this point. Isn't that right, guys?
Yes.
So I'm going to open the floor because I'm sure there are lots of people dying to talk to you and ask you questions, because you've also posed questions to us. And I think one of the things we should also maybe think about is, how do we help them answer their questions? So please, Kingsley.
Right, yeah, Kingsley, University of Nigeria. Yeah, I wanted to just ask a very interesting presentation, I must say, presenting another angle, a refutation, if that is the right word, to Schneider's model, which reflect what Jovis will talk about tomorrow with regard to Nigerian English. Which my interest lie. I wanted to know if you guys have begun to think about alternatives. Are we any kind of alternative to Schneider's model to address, specifically address secular colonial Englishes, as we find that the dynamic model is insufficient, if that's the word to use in addressing this. And secondly, even though I think that's one of the questions you posed, I don't know if I'm posing the question back to you, but I have written it before I saw your question, before I saw the question. Right, but I was thinking about other varieties of settler English, like New Zealand, where we have the Maori English, for instance, which is emerging. And are we going? Do we need a different model to account for that? I do not know so much about indigenous English, so to speak, in Canada. Like I've heard about Maori English in New Zealand. So isn't that going to reflect? We need a different set of toolkits to talk about this English in New Zealand as against Canada. Is Canada an exception or New Zealand an exception? I don't know. Let me my question got across clearly.
You want to start, Derek?
Sure, yeah. In terms of alternatives, okay, I think something that I really appreciate about Schneider's model is that it's holistic, right? And like we said, like it allowed us to really like critique it and think about alternatives, right? And I think what you're getting at in terms of alternatives in both of your both aspects of your question is that the local context is absolutely critical. There may not be a single evolutionary trajectory, right? Each individual instance of contact like this is going to have its own nuances. So I'm not sure what an alternative might be. I guess our alternative is to think about the specific sociolinguistic consequences of the colonial context. Like we said in the question though, and like you're anticipating with your question about New Zealand, is that even within like a settler colonial context, there's going to be nuances. And the big difference between New Zealand and Canada, as far as I can see, is that in New Zealand, there is one indigenous language, Maori. And in Canada, there were hundreds of pre-contact languages. And there are still dozens, if not over 100. And so the type of, what's the word I'm looking for? The amount of attention that can be given to Maori is much greater than the amount of attention that can be given to each individual indigenous language in the Canadian context. So one thing that is a big challenge in Canada and that doesn't have an obvious answer is how do we give indigenous languages official language status, right? And what would that look like? What would that mean, right? And it's actually not extremely obvious that would be a good thing, because by making indigenous languages official languages in the Canadian context, that might actually take resources out of individual communities where those resources are much more needed, right? So it's not an obvious question. But in New Zealand, making Maori an official language, that seems a lot easier to work with, right? And once that happens, right, and once settler children are learning Maori as a second language from elementary school, right, there will be more of that contact, right? And so what I'm trying to say is that like the context is critical. Alex, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I think you've said it all. I mean, the interesting question about these indigenous varieties that emerge in different contexts, I think a real question sort of to think about is, do those follow something more akin to what Schneider is proposing? Or is there a separate pathway that they follow? Bearing in mind that when they emerge in a context of settler colonialism, there's something particularly profound going on there, because the context is one in which the speakers of those varieties are colonized in an ongoing way, and they have been subject to overt policies and pressures from the metropole as peoples to be erased. And language, we know, is this key carrier of identity. So in that context, it is less, I think, about mutual negotiation, because there is no mutual negotiation, but rather there's the emergence of this variety that is reflective of a cultural identity that emerges as an English that then has features that reflect what the indigenous language was, and that reflect cultural elements of being a member of that cultural group. So I think that there's really interesting theoretical questions there. And I answer that in speaking as a linguist and a sociolinguist, but as I answer that, I also remember that what we're talking about is what happens in the face of violence and racism, right? So we're really talking about hard realities in the emergence of a variety, right? It's not different in that sense. I don't think when we talk about African-American language and a variety that emerged under enslavement. Right. So I think there are complicated questions that we need to think about as a field, and we need to move forward carefully and responsibly. So this goes a little back to the point that we made about, engaging with critical theory from outside sociolinguistics, because I think a real danger here is to begin to label varieties on the basis of what we see in language. And that we can't, I'm just going to say it, we can't do that, right? Like that is irresponsible science, right? So what is going on the ground sociopolitically, socioculturally, and then how is that reflected in language might be a better way to think about it.
I believe Alfred wanted to contribute from the virtual audience that we have. I'll go ahead and give them audio permissions. Alfred, if you could just unmute yourself and.
Yes, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you just fine.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, all good, Alfred, go first.
Okay. My question is easier than Kingsley's. It comes from your second question at the end, which starts with this statement: there are indigenous Englishes in settler colonial context. How is this consistent with your observation that despite the vastness of Canada as a country, there is widespread or there is huge homogeneity of English? So in other words, are you able to observe those indigenous Englishes within Canada? Because you gave the impression that in a settler colonial setting, there's this erasure of languages, of cultures. So did these indigenous Englishes still manage to survive in Canada?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm just going to find. Where's my
I'm not sure that was an easier question. I have to tell you.
It's easier than
Okay.
Kingsley's.
So if we do look at the map we have here, right, you'll see that, like I like to call this the banana-shaped dialect region of Canada, right? You'll see that this isn't a circle around the entire country of Canada, right? It's a circle around what is essentially, and for the most part, about 40 kilometers north of, this isn't 40 kilometers, but essentially 40 kilometers north of the US border. That's where the vast majority of the Canadian population lives, is within 40, maybe it's not 40, maybe it's 100 kilometers of the US border, right? And you can see that, parts of Northern Ontario, parts of Northern Quebec, this map doesn't even have the territories on it, right? They're absent from here. We know very little about the English spoken in these places. The thing about this dialect region is that it is always relativized to middle class urban, and although it's never said explicitly, really, to white people as well. Right? There is diversity within this region, right? There are sociolects, there are ethnolects, there might be a multi-ethnolect. You can tune into my other work for that, but there is diversity, right? When we talk about a homogeneous Canadian English, we're talking about a hegemonic normative standard. Okay. Right? And that's something that is shared by middle-class, urban, by and large, white folks in Toronto, in Ottawa, in Vancouver, in Victoria, in Winnipeg, right? In these major urban areas, right? The Indigenous Englishes that exist in Canada exist among a diversity of these other regional ethnolectal varieties. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, I think I would add to that too, that, you asked about how did they survive? and I think that I would say to you, they didn't, they emerged. And they emerged despite huge pressures not to emerge. And I think that you can contrast something like the situation in New Zealand. So let's go back to New Zealand, where you have one Indigenous language, Māori English, very, very distinctive, is available as a matter of course, on Māori TV and Māori radio and other digital sound platforms. And then you contrast that with a place like Canada, which has extensive linguistic diversity in its Indigenous peoples, and folks have talked about, quote, in the States, so in Canada, we talk about First Nations, Métis, and Inuit as our Indigenous peoples. In the States, they talk about, Indian bands. Now, people have talked about Indian English and have described sort of features that they think sort of spread vastly across them. That's looking at a very superficial level. Yet the more we dive into what's going on in a situation like Canada, I had a PhD student who recently finished. She was working in northern British Columbia, where there's a very specific linguistic family, the Denis language family, and she was working with kids, and there were very clearly features that were emerging in local English that were from Denis. So you wouldn't expect to have those features you wouldn't expect to find them locally in Toronto or Mississauga or around Ottawa, where the linguistic families are very, very different than what you get here on the west coast of Canada. So that you are beginning to see that variability emerging, as we move out of the residential school system. Like the last residential school was only closed 25 years ago. This is not the past. This is today. Those schools were open when I was in school, right? And those schools intentionally split children up so that they weren't with kids from similar language backgrounds, right? So you had this real effort to eradicate. So those varieties are now emerging as Indigenous groups are being left more on their own, and there's less forced removal by the Canadian nation state. So I think it's less a question of asking about survival and more a question about seeing them emerge, in the face of all of this horror at the end of the day.
Iris's hand is the first one I've seen, and then Alex is next.
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you for the presentation, and really thank you for presenting that even Tuck's decolonization is not a metaphor text, because it's an incredible text and really useful. And so in not necessarily asking a question, but offering some to that your questions at the end of your presentation, particularly in terms of reading beyond linguistics and reading outside of our field, I just wanted to offer that Canadian geographer Catherine McKittrick has offered so much help in thinking about language change and language shift, and the way that we think about just how diaspora and displacement impact the way that we understand language, that I just wanted to offer up her text, Demonic Grounds, as a place to start for you guys as you're going through thinking about some of your questions that you've posed. Catherine McKittrick particularly engages US and Caribbean scholar Sylvia Winter's work, which is often very difficult to access in terms of how she speaks about critical theory. But Catherine McKittrick makes it legible in order to apply it to different contexts, especially linguistic contexts. So I just wanted to offer that up as an additional text. So Catherine McKittrick's Demonic Grounds.
Thank you. Can't wait to read it.
Alex, you're up next.
Yeah, thank you so much. Fascinating talk. It actually resonates so much with what we've been covering in the summer school. So thank you so much. I guess the question that I've got is that in some sense more political. I don't know whether it's wise to have this recorded or not, but I'm not being counsel, but how do we reconcile our sort of relationship with some of the funding bodies actually which are interested in English linguistics? But this is not applicable only to English linguistics, right? But to many so big councils. Many of these people do work in the name of advancing the state of knowledge, but at the same time, they have this difficult relationship in also perpetuating colonialism and its impact. So how do we, it is quite political in some sense, because these people give us money to do our research, but at the same time, when we are, so how do we sort of reconcile that difficult relationship, I suppose, is something that I wanted to sort of pick the brain on. So yeah.
Even two brains. You got
Yeah.
two brains for the
Yeah.
price of one today.
That's a tricky question. And I think there are a number of ways we could answer it. Are you sort of thinking about in terms of how do we change the way that the funding agencies work? Or are you thinking about it from the perspective of how do we change our own relationship to the funders?
I suppose both, right? Because I get because I'm not naming people, it makes it harder to sort of contextualize that discussion, I suppose. But in some sense, right? So when we're doing English linguistics, for example, it's easy to think about. I really appreciated your point about how the colonialism has its impact in the past, but also its impact and legacy still rings true today, right? And how do we reconcile our own relationship with these funding bodies, and how can we make an impact so that we're not just a vehicle for perpetuating colonialism in that sense, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, I have ideas. Derek, do you want to start again, or would you like me to jump?
I'd love to hear your ideas.
Nicely done, Derek.
Yeah. Well, I think, and this is both a simple answer and a complicated answer, is that, Derek and I were talking about obligations and responsibilities that we have as human beings and as scholars. And I think that the first stage is to critically assess and interrogate and query our own assumptions and our own ways of thinking about the work that we do. And that's the most important first step, because then how are you framing the work that you're trying to sell to the funder, as it were, which is really about talking to your colleagues and framing the work that you do. And that means not expecting somebody else to teach you how to decolonize your mind, but it means taking responsibility for learning and thinking and reflecting and having this continuously open mind to what it is to be a colonizer and a colonized person, right? So the example that I give is one of the things that we talk about when we do our research is, the creation when we're training students, because in Canada, it's really the KM, the knowledge mobilization and student training component is really, really critical when you're talking to the funders. So what are we going to do? And so we have to wrap up. So one of the things that we do in that, though, is to talk about developing critically engaged citizens as the next generation. Citizenship itself is a colonial concept, right? So it's easy to just be so blinded by it and not recognize it. So this is why I say, taking personal responsibility and thinking about the work that we do. And as we shift the type of the research, what I have actually found is that, at least in Canada with the tri-agencies, there is some responsiveness by the agencies, because they are actually run by academics themselves, right? The president of SSHRC is an academic who has been seconded out of his university role, to lead the social sciences and humanities research network. So if you're in regular conversation with them through the work that you do and through opportunities to engage, we can begin to remediate those relationships. I think that would be my first answer. And I know we have to stop, we're running out of time.
Derek, you're saved by the bell. Listen, guys, I just wanted to say thank you so much from me personally, but also from the entire audience who really, really enjoyed this session this afternoon. Please do keep following us.
We will. Thanks for having us. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much.